Here is a contradiction that should stop you cold the next time you are standing in the bread aisle. The loaf of bread you are holding, the one with the words whole grain, heart healthy, or 12 grain printed across the bag in earthy brown lettering, can legally contain as little as 51% whole grain by weight and still carry those claims. It can contain dough conditioners that were banned in the United Kingdom 12 years ago. It can contain a preservative, calcium propionate, that some studies have flagged for further research regarding behavioral effects in children. It can be sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. It can be softened with an emulsifier called Datem, which is produced using processes that, in certain European countries, trigger disclosure requirements the FDA does not mirror. And it can still, with every one of those ingredients inside of it, be marketed to you as wholesome, traditional, and artisan. That is not a loophole. That is the current state of American bread law. And tonight, I am going to walk you through exactly what is in the bread you're eating, why the trust you have placed in certain brands may not be earned, and how to identify a loaf that is actually what it pretends to be. Over the last 5 months, I have examined the ingredient panels and nutrition facts on more than 60 commercial bread products sold in major American grocery chains. I pulled data from the FDA's Code of Federal Regulations Title 21, specifically the sections governing bread standards of identity, which have not been meaningfully updated in decades. I reviewed the USDA's published thresholds for the whole grain claim, cross-referenced against the Whole Grains Council's independent certification criteria. I examined peer-reviewed studies on calcium propionate, azodicarbonamide, potassium bromate, and datum from journals including Food Additives and Contaminants, the International Journal of Food Science and Nutrition, and the Journal of the Science of Food and Agriculture. I spoke at length with a retired bakery scientist who spent 22 years working in industrial dough formulation for 2 different major national bread manufacturers. The reason this matters now, in 2026, is that commercial bread in the United States has undergone a quiet transformation over the past 2 decades, driven by the need to extend shelf life, improve dough machinability on high-speed production lines, and hit aggressive price points at retail. Research indicates that the cumulative intake of certain industrial additives from the modern American diet may warrant closer scrutiny, and some of those additives show up most prominently in the single food most Americans eat every single day of their lives. That food is bread. And the brands you trust most, the brands your mother trusted, the brands with the decades-old logos, and the soft bag with the twist tie, have in many cases drifted further from real bread than you might ever imagine. Let me start with the additive that former bakery scientists most often flag when I ask them what consumers should worry about. That additive is azodicarbonamide, sometimes abbreviated ADEA. It is a dough conditioner that strengthens gluten networks and allows for faster, higher volume industrial production. It is also used in the manufacturing of yoga mats, which is not a talking point, it is a literal chemical reality. The European Union banned azodicarbonamide in food as a precautionary measure years ago. Australia banned it. Singapore banned it. The United States still permits it, with a limit of 45 parts per million in flour. In 2014, under public pressure, several major fast food chains publicly removed it from their buns, but it remains legal in commercial bread, and it still appears in certain budget store-brand loaves and national brand sandwich breads marketed to families. The second additive to know is potassium bromate, which has been banned in the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Brazil, and several other countries based on research flagging potential health concerns. It is still legal in the United States at the federal level, though California requires a Proposition 65 warning label on products containing it. Some American bread manufacturers have voluntarily phased it out. Others have not. You cannot always tell from the front of the bag. You have to read the back. The third additive is calcium propionate, E282 on European labels, used as a mold inhibitor. It is what allows a loaf of sandwich bread to sit in your pantry for 2 weeks without visible mold. Studies have investigated whether this preservative may contribute to behavioral and digestive effects in sensitive individuals, particularly children. And while the research is ongoing and not definitive, several international food policy groups have recommended reduced exposure, especially for young consumers. The fourth additive is DATEM, short for diacetyl tartaric acid esters of mono and diglycerides, which is an emulsifier that improves dough handling and crumb softness. DATEM is legal in both the US and EU, but several peer-reviewed studies have raised questions about its interaction with gut microbiota. The fifth red flag is the use of high fructose corn syrup as the sweetener in a product sold as wholesome or artisan. Open your bag of bread at home right now. If the ingredient list contains high fructose corn syrup and the bag uses words like natural, traditional, or country style, you are looking at a marketing contradiction. The manufacturer is counting on you not to notice. Now let me walk you through the specific categories of bread I would encourage you to rethink. The first category is the sliced white sandwich bread sold under major national brand names. Many of these loaves contain enriched wheat flour, which means the flour has been stripped of its bran and germ during milling and then had synthetic vitamins added back in. You are not eating whole wheat. You are eating white flour with a multivitamin sprinkled through it. That is not wholesome. That is a cosmetic repair job. The second category is the bread labeled wheat, which sounds like whole wheat, but legally is not. Under current labeling rules, the word wheat on a bread label simply indicates that the primary grain is wheat, which is true of white bread as well. If the bag does not say 100% whole wheat, you are probably looking at a product made predominantly from enriched white flour with some whole wheat added for color and marketing. The third category is the honey wheat or honey oat loaf, which is often a white flour bread with a small amount of honey or molasses added for color and a whisper of flavor. And in many cases, the sweetener is actually high fructose corn syrup with honey added as a secondary ingredient. The fourth category is the 12-grain or 9-grain bread, where the multiple grains are primarily a cosmetic inclusion. The base flour is still often enriched wheat flour, and the additional grains, while genuinely present, make up a small fraction of the total weight. The fifth category is the artisan-style bread sold in plastic bags at major chains, which attempts to mimic the appearance and marketing of a neighborhood bakery loaf, but often contains the same industrial dough conditioners as the standard sliced varieties. A rapid-fire tour through the sensory tells of industrial bread. Squeeze the loaf. Real bread, made with real flour, water, yeast, and salt, has a structure that resists compression and slowly springs back. Industrial bread, stuffed with dough conditioners and emulsifiers, compresses to almost nothing and bounces back too quickly, like memory foam. Open the bag and smell. Real bread smells faintly sour, faintly yeasty, faintly like warm grain. Industrial bread often smells sweet, almost candy sweet, from the added sugars and caramelized color compounds. Look at the crumb structure when you slice it. Real bread has irregular holes of varying sizes from natural fermentation. Industrial bread has a uniform, pour-like texture from chemical leavening and high-speed mixing. Toast a slice. Real bread develops deep color from actual Maillard browning and tastes nutty, complex. Industrial bread often develops color unevenly and tastes flat, with a lingering sweetness that has no place in toast. These are not just aesthetic judgments. They are diagnostic of what is actually inside the loaf. I want to slow down and take you into the deep dive section of this investigation, because there is one ingredient I have barely touched on, and it deserves its own spotlight. That ingredient is enriched wheat flour, which appears as the first ingredient in the vast majority of commercial breads sold in American grocery stores. The word enriched sounds positive. It suggests that the flour has been made better. In reality, enriched wheat flour is a technical term describing flour that has been stripped of its nutrient-rich bran and germ during the industrial milling process, processed into fine white flour, and then had synthetic vitamins and iron added back in to restore a fraction of what was removed. The process removes the fiber, the wheat germ oil, the majority of the B vitamins, the majority of the minerals, and most of the phytonutrients. It replaces a small number of them in synthetic form. Then it calls the result enriched, as if that word were an upgrade rather than a partial repair of a deliberate subtraction. The reason this happens is that white flour is shelf-stable almost indefinitely, while whole wheat flour goes rancid within weeks due to the oils in the germ. The industrial food system prefers shelf stability. Your body prefers the whole grain. Those two preferences have been in quiet conflict for over 100 years, and the industrial preference has won almost every round. A retired bakery scientist I spoke with for this investigation described the decision-making inside large commercial bakeries in terms I want to share with you directly. He said the single biggest driver of ingredient choices in modern industrial bread is not taste, not nutrition, not even cost in isolation. It is machinability. Dough conditioners, emulsifiers, and chemical strengtheners are added to bread dough not because they make bread taste better, but because they allow industrial mixers, industrial dividers, and industrial ovens to process dough at speeds and volumes that real bread dough could never tolerate. Real bread dough is alive. It ferments, it develops, it responds to temperature, it breathes. Industrial bread dough has been chemically engineered to behave like a manufacturing substrate, consistent and predictable, so that a factory can produce tens of thousands of loaves per hour with minimal human intervention. The ingredients that make this possible are the dough conditioners and additives you see in the ingredient list. They are there to serve the factory, not to serve you. Let me take you into a comparative examination of bread from different countries, because the contrast is educational. A classic French baguette, sold in any bakery in France, is typically made from 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and salt. French bread law actually prohibits the use of certain additives common in American industrial bread. German bread, one of the most diverse bread cultures on earth, traditionally contains a wide variety of whole grains, seeds, and sourdough starters, with minimal industrial additives. Italian bread, similarly, is traditionally made from simple ingredients with long fermentation times. The American industrial sandwich bread, by comparison, often contains 15 to 25 ingredients, many of them industrial additives with no counterpart in European bread tradition. This is not a claim that European bread is universally better, or that American bread is universally worse. It is a factual observation about the state of industrial bread in different regulatory environments. The FDA has permitted a broader range of additives than the European Food Safety Authority, and American bread formulations have taken advantage of that latitude in ways that European formulations have not been allowed to. I want to spend a moment on the sourdough question, because sourdough has become a marketing term in recent years in ways that consumers should understand. True sourdough, the kind that has been made for thousands of years in bread traditions around the world, uses a naturally fermented starter of flour and water, populated with wild yeasts and lactobacillus bacteria, to leaven the bread. This long fermentation process, typically 12 to 36 hours, breaks down some of the gluten structures and some of the phytic acid in the flour, which studies suggest may improve digestibility for many people, and may alter the glycemic response compared to yeast-leavened bread. Real sourdough is a genuinely different category of bread. However, the word sourdough on a commercial bread label is not tightly regulated. Many commercial products labeled sourdough are simply yeast-leavened bread, with a small amount of dried sourdough flavor powder added, or a small amount of sourdough culture included in an otherwise conventional bread formulation. If you want the benefits and the flavor of real sourdough, you need to look for a bread that specifies long fermentation, that lists a sourdough starter, or sourdough culture as an ingredient, and that ideally comes from an artisan bakery rather than an industrial production line. A true sourdough loaf has a distinctive tangy flavor, a crumb structure with irregular holes, and a crust that crackles when you press it. A fake sourdough tastes vaguely sour from added flavoring, but has none of the other characteristics. A rapid tour of specific bread categories I have not yet addressed. The English muffin, which in many commercial versions contains the same industrial additives as sandwich bread plus additional dough conditioners to create the signature nook and cranny texture. The bagel, which in its industrial form has drifted far from the traditional recipe of flour, water, yeast, salt, and malt, and often contains high fructose corn syrup, dough conditioners, and preservatives that would horrify a traditional bagel baker. The tortilla, particularly the flour tortilla, which often contains partially hydrogenated oils or trans fats in the form of lard substitutes, along with a long list of preservatives to maintain softness. The hamburger bun, which is engineered for a specific squish factor, and often contains more sugar, more oil, and more dough conditioners than even standard sandwich bread. The dinner roll sold in commercial brown and serve format, which is essentially a partially baked industrial bread loaded with preservatives to survive the extended shelf life. Each of these categories deserves the same scrutiny you would apply to sliced sandwich bread, and the same rules apply. Read the ingredient list. Count the ingredients. Check for whole grain first. Check for added sugars and industrial additives. Let me shift now into what you can do, practically, starting with your very next grocery trip. First, read the ingredient list before you look at anything else. A real bread loaf contains somewhere between 4 and 10 ingredients. Flour, water, yeast, salt, sometimes a small amount of oil, or sweetener, sometimes a dough enhancer from a natural source like malted barley. Anything beyond 10 ingredients, particularly if those extra ingredients are chemical names you would need to Google, is a sign you are holding an industrial product. Second, check that the first ingredient is explicitly whole wheat flour, or whole grain rye, or whole spelt, or another intact whole grain. If it says enriched wheat flour first, it is white bread, regardless of the color or the marketing. Third, look at the sodium. Many commercial breads contain more sodium per slice than you would expect, and when you eat 2 slices in a sandwich, the numbers add up quickly. 400 milligrams of sodium in a sandwich before you add anything else is not uncommon. Fourth, consider the sugar. Real bread needs a tiny amount of sugar or honey to feed the yeast during fermentation, and that amount should be under 2 grams per slice. If your slice has 4 or 5 grams of added sugar, you are eating a cake disguised as bread. Fifth, visit a local bakery or farmer's market and buy a single loaf of real bread for comparison. Take it home. Eat a slice. Taste the difference. You will not be able to go back to the plastic bag, and that is the point. Sixth, if you want to eliminate uncertainty entirely, consider baking your own bread once a week. A no-knead recipe requires 4 ingredients and 20 minutes of active time. You control every variable. Seventh, when you must buy commercial bread, seek out brands that publicly disclose their full ingredient sourcing and that meet the Whole Grains Council 100% stamp standard, which is more stringent than the FDA's front-of-package whole grain claim. I spoke with a nutritionist who specializes in digestive health, and she told me that, in her clinical practice, she has seen increasing numbers of clients who experience symptoms when eating commercial bread that they do not experience when eating traditional bread made with simple ingredients and long fermentation. The symptoms include bloating, fatigue after meals, digestive discomfort, and brain fog. These individuals often initially suspect they have a gluten sensitivity, and some of them test negative for celiac disease, but still respond positively to gluten-free diets. However, when she has some of these clients try traditional sourdough bread made with long fermentation instead of standard commercial bread, many of them report that their symptoms do not occur or are significantly reduced. She is careful to note that this is clinical observation rather than controlled research, but she believes the evidence points toward the industrial additives and the short fermentation times of commercial bread as a possible factor in modern wheat sensitivity symptoms for some people. Studies in this area are ongoing, and research is not conclusive, but the observation is worth knowing about if you have experienced unexplained symptoms after eating bread. The path from industrial bread to real bread is, for most families, a gradual transition rather than an overnight change. You do not need to commit to baking every loaf you eat. You do not need to source exotic flours or invest in expensive equipment. The first step is simply awareness, the kind you now have after reading the ingredient lists with different eyes. The second step is replacement, 1 loaf at a time, as you find better alternatives in your local stores or bakeries. The third step, if you choose to take it, is experimentation. Baking a loaf of bread yourself to discover how simple and satisfying it can be. Each step in this progression is a legitimate stopping point. You do not need to become an artisan baker to eat better bread. You just need to be an informed consumer who knows what to look for and what to avoid. Here is what I want you to walk away with tonight. Bread was one of the first foods humanity ever made. For most of human history, bread contained exactly 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and salt. The loaf you are eating today, the one wrapped in plastic with the cartoon logo and the soft, squishy texture, is a product that would be almost unrecognizable to your great-grandmother. And the transformation happened quietly, decade by decade, reformulation by reformulation, each small change invisible until the entire category of food had drifted into something new. You have the right to know what you are feeding your family. You have the right to choose real bread. And you have the right to demand that the word bread, when printed on a bag in your grocery store, means what it has always meant. The shift does not have to be dramatic. One loaf at a time, one ingredient panel at a time, one Saturday morning at a bakery instead of a supermarket. That is how you take this back. And once you have tasted real bread again, you will understand exactly why the industrial version lost you.